Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tip of the Week. This week I'm coming to you guys from Finland, just finishing up here in Finland, and I'm on my way to Poland. So as I'm sure you guys can tell from the fact that I keep mentioning this at the beginning of my videos, I just thought it would be interesting for you to know that we are all across the globe in all kinds of different countries, all kinds of different people from different walks of life and different languages use our products. So I think it's kind of interesting for you to be aware of that. So this week I thought I would do a quick tip, not an involved tip, but a quick tip, and I'm going to call this one XSheet Basics. So I'm going to do this tip today in Animate Pro, and I just decided to do this because then you can see how it works in Animate, Animate Pro, and Harmony all in one go. It pretty much works the same in all three platforms. And if you think about it, the timeline is a horizontal representation of what's happening in your scene over the course of time. In other words, you've got your layer here, and then you've got your marker on the top of your timeline here that indicates the frame number, and you have this playhead that you can drag to adjust the current frame. When you're working in the XSheet, it's a very similar aspect. You've got, instead of having a horizontal layer, you have what we call a vertical column, and the vertical column has a name just like the layer has a name, and in fact they will be the same. And you also have on the left hand side of everything the frame number indicator. So you can still use your shortcuts to go forward and backward a frame. It's the period to go forward a frame and the comma to go backward a frame. If you have drawings in there, then there are different shortcuts to go to the previous and the next drawing, and I'll go into that in a second. So, of course, you can have multiple drawing layers. Like if I add a new drawing layer, when I add a new drawing layer to my timeline, it also shows up in my XSheet. And anything that you do in your timeline will show up in your XSheet and vice versa. In other words, they are tied together. They are just two different ways of representing the same thing. So you might say to me, well, Lily, why would I want to use the XSheet instead of using the timeline? And there's a couple of reasons why, and one of the reasons why is that when you're working from the XSheet, you have the ability to see an actual visual representation of what's in that frame. In other words, let's say I take this frame, let's go in frame 1, and I'll draw a drawing in here, I'll call this 1. Okay, so this is drawing 1. By default, when you just start drawing and you create a drawing, it creates drawings with numbers. So if I just do a drawing in the first frame, it calls it drawing 1. If I go to a frame later on and I do another drawing, it's going to call it drawing 2 because it's the second drawing in this drawing layer, and so on and so forth. So maybe I have 3, let's just do a few more, 4, and let's do 5. Okay, so now I've got these 5 drawings in here. When I'm looking at my timeline, I can see, due to the vertical line here, that there's a new drawing on that frame, but I can't actually see what the drawing is. In the timeline, you do have the ability to show what we call here the data view, and when you show the data view, as you drag your playhead over, you see the number here in the current frame. So you have that readout there. Consequently, also, if you have your library window open, the library will show what the current drawing is in the drawing substitution window as well. But that being said, it's really useful in the XSheet view to be able to see what those drawings are. And there's a few different ways that we can work with the XSheet that are kind of different and kind of the same to what we do in the timeline. So one of the things is you can select drawings in here, and when you select a drawing in here, there are 3 different areas that you can adjust in this cell. There's the very left-hand side, and when you mouse over the left-hand side, you get this plus. There's the center of the drawing, and the center of the drawing allows you to select drawings. You can also double-click on a drawing, so I'll talk about what those do in a second. And then you've got the right-hand side, and when you mouse over the right-hand side, you get that up-down arrow. And so let's talk about what these different things do. I'll just go to drawing 5 to show this as an example. So on drawing 5, if I mouse over the left-hand side, I have this drawing selected, and I drag it. What it's going to do is it's going to move the current drawing. So when you drag from the left-hand side where the plus shows up, the left-hand side allows you to drag the position of the current drawing. If you drag all the way from the right-hand side where you have the up and down arrow, if you, for example, drag down from there, what it does is it actually extends the exposure of the frame. So it won't allow you to remove exposure, only to extend it, but it's good to know that that's a quick and easy way to extend the exposure. So let's say, for example, if I'm on frame or on drawing 4 here and I drag down, by default what it does is it overwrites the frames on the next drawing. In other words, you can see down here it says overwrite, and as I drag on the right hand side, it's not moving these drawings down, it's just overwriting the current drawing. So let's undo a couple of steps here. If I double click on this guy, or I click once on it instead, it will turn it to insert. So let's say, for example, if I just drag down when insert mode is on, do you see the difference? Do you see that when insert mode was on, it actually shifted these other frames down? So it's useful to understand what these different options do because depending on what it is that you're trying to do at that particular moment, you might want to choose to do something different. And the other thing that's really interesting about the XSheet view, I mentioned before that you can see the name of the drawing, which is really nice. The other thing that's really nice is being able to quickly swap to a different drawing. So, you know, when you're in your timeline and you select a drawing and you look in your library window, you can swap, and this is a very nice visual representation of what's going on, so I could swap there to drawing 5. That's one way of doing it, and that's fine. But there's another way of doing it in your XSheet. If you double click on the current cell, you can enter the drawing number that you want to swap to, and that's going to swap to that drawing on that frame. So in other words, on this frame 7 here, I swapped to drawing 3. Frame 8 still stays with drawing 5. But since I swapped to drawing 3 on this frame, you know, the difference between what happens in the timeline and the XSheet is if I swap on this frame in the timeline, it will swap it all the way until the next tick. It's just the way it works in the timeline. So in other words, if I select this frame here and I swap the drawing here, it's going to swap it all the way to here. In the XSheet, instead, when you swap a frame, it only swaps the current frame. But after that, if you're in overwrite mode, you can always go back and drag that down if you want and overwrite the other drawings. Or you could have it in insert mode and you could drag it down and shift the other drawings down. So these are just a few different options of things that you can do in your XSheet, but the most important thing to understand is left-hand side is to move, middle is to select, or to double click and swap the drawing on the current frame. It's important to understand, by the way, here, when you double click and you enter a number, it is in fact swapping the drawing, it is not renaming the drawing. If you actually want to rename this drawing to something else, so let's say if I try to rename this, I double click on it and I think I can rename it this way. I double click on it and I hit 6. When I do that, whoops, now I have an empty drawing here. And the reason that I have an empty drawing here is because when you double click and you enter a number, it swaps to that drawing. So effectively, I just said swap to drawing 6. But drawing 6 does not contain anything, which is why it seems blank. So let's go back to 3 here. And let's just drag that down. So actually, I put it back in overwrite mode, so I can just drag this down. I got 3 everywhere there. Okay. So if instead what I'd like to do is I would like to rename drawing 3 to 6, then the way to do that is you select the drawing, you right click on the drawing, and then you can select drawings, rename drawing. And when you rename the drawing, it's renaming the actual drawing on the file system. So if I had 3 showing up multiple times in my scene and I decide to change it to 3A, then every time that I have 3 showing, it will show 3A instead. So, you know, for example, if I have 3A showing here, and now it's going to show that same drawing 3. Consequently, if I try instead to enter 3, 3 is now empty because I renamed drawing 3 to 3A, therefore 3 no longer has any content. And when you think about the way that it works in the timeline, for some reason the timeline always seems to make sense to people. The XSheet is one of these things that it makes sense to you if you come from a traditional background, but if you don't, you really don't feel comfortable with the XSheet. I highly recommend that even if you come from a Flash background or a digital background, that you at least give a shot using the XSheet, because I think you don't have to use it all the time, but I think it's useful to understand what it's doing, because especially if you're doing things like lip sync, it can be very useful to have a visual guide here of what the drawings are that you're working with. Now I just want to talk about one other quick thing here, and that is that you have the ability in the columns here to add various different types of column. And one of the useful ones in here, a lot of these other ones you probably won't touch. These are creating curves. You know, if you want to create your own curves, they're going to be created automatically when you create a peg layer. But in the case where you actually want to create some notes to go with your scene, this is where annotation comes in handy. And if we select the annotation column, what the annotation column does is it creates a column that you can actually draw in. So just like you would on a traditional XSheet, you might have, you know, this is where the jump, whoa, sorry, I started drawing off the edge there, so let me try to draw within here. Jump, and then it's going to actually just keep that note there for that frame, and then maybe I have some frames where nothing has taken place. And when you're drawing in the annotation column, if you just start drawing in here, by default you have the brush tool selected. You can use your select tool, which will select a number of frames if you want to move the frames down. And then, you know, back to the brush tool again. If you double click on a cell here, then you can type some stuff in. So type stuff in and then hit enter. So you have the ability to draw or to type or to do both. And the annotation column is something that's extremely useful. For those of you who are on Harmony instead of Animate Pro, there have been some improvements that have been made to the annotation column just to make it easier to read. You'll notice now that in the new annotation column there is some anti-aliasing. You have an eraser tool that you can use. It just looks a little bit nicer. But we are hopefully going to bring those developments down to the other versions next time we have a version of Animate and Animate Pro available. Okay guys, so you know, that's it for my quick introduction to what's going on with the XSheet. And so, you know, for those of you that are interested, I can always pick up later on and perhaps do a session on what shift and trace means. And shift and trace is a useful XSheet functionality for those of you who will be doing that frame by frame paperless style of animation. But for now, I think I just want to end it there with this XSheet introduction so that those of you who are interested in giving it a shot can try that out. So thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.